Hello everyone, you should have a note-taking guide there in front of you to fill in the highlighted areas here. I'm going to go over with you about how new species can arise. All right, so first we need to define exactly what a species is, and that's a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So in other words, those offspring are able to give rise to more offspring and so on. So they have to be able to reproduce and make babies that can then reproduce. And the process of creating a new distinct species is called speciation. All right, the formation of a new species is titled speciation. And generally, over thousands, if not millions of years, new species come about because species will accumulate different adaptations, different differences, and so on, that they eventually become so different from one another that they cannot interbreed anymore. They'll have sterile babies usually to start with, and then eventually the parts don't fit anymore, so to speak. And so they're not able to reproduce anymore. So eventually, and this takes a long, long time, thinking, hundreds of generations for this to happen. So to make a new species. If you're not done, you want to go ahead and pause this. So I'm going to move on to the next screen, okay? So if a population, there's a couple ways that this can happen, but one of them is if a population becomes separated or isolated, that group might evolve differently over time than the group that they've been separated from. And this eventually leads to so many differences between those two populations that they can't interbreed anymore. And this is called reproductive isolation, and that eventually can lead to a new species forming between the two. For example, in the picture there, perhaps something happens, a flood or something, and it creates a river where there wasn't one before, and it separates the species of deer from one another. And eventually that one species evolves into two because one of them will develop new traits and characteristics to where eventually they won't be able to breed anymore. I'm going to move to the next slide. If you're not done, go ahead and hit pause now. So there are three different types of species, new types of making speciation. I just realized this one isn't highlighted as well as it should be. So pay attention to what you're writing in there, okay? So reproductive isolation is usually one of the first steps towards making a new species. And then there's three factors that can affect this or that can bring about this reproductive isolation. The first one is called geographic isolation. The second one is temporal isolation. And the third one is behavioral isolation. If you notice, there's two types of speciation. The first one is called allopatric speciation, and then there's also sympatric speciation, and I'll go over what those two mean here towards the end of this slideshow. So there's three processes that can lead to reproductive isolation. The first is geographic isolation, the second is temporal isolation, and the third one is behavioral isolation. All three of those can lead to reproductive isolation, which is how we get to new species, because those species won't be able to reproduce anymore. Again, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Hit pause if you're not quite finished putting all this into your notes. So let's dig into each one of those three a little bit deeper. So the first one, geographic isolation, is literally there is a physical barrier that is going to separate out that original population. Perhaps an earthquake happens. Maybe a river goes through it now all of a sudden, like in the image there. But as time passes, the environment may select for different traits, and the two populations become genetically different and eventually so different that they can't reproduce and make fertile offspring anymore. Examples include rivers, even mountains forming, and bodies of water where there weren't any bodies of water before. So those can lead to geographic isolation. Go ahead and hit pause. I'm going to move on to the next slide if you're not done yet. So here's one example. The kaibab and the Abert squirrels. So the kaibab squirrel was on one side of the Grand Canyon, and the other side of the Grand Canyon is the Abert squirrel. Even though they were at one time one species together, with the formation of the Grand Canyon, they became geographically isolated from one another and have evolved into their own species, the kaibab squirrel and the Abert squirrel. And they both live on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon, but they came from a common ancestor. Another example is this fish. We've got the blue-headed wrasse and the Cortez rainbow wrasse, and this separation occurred when the Isthmus of Panama was formed. And now there's two different species of fish, one on each side of Central America there. So they can no longer reproduce. They really look similar, but you can definitely notice some differences, such as their size, their fins. They are two different fish and cannot make fertile offspring together. So they were separated by this isthmus that came through Panama and created two new species. Okay, the second type that can lead to reproductive isolation is temporal isolation. In temporal isolation, this comes about because groups of individuals will start to reproduce at different times. And because they're reproducing at different times, the genes don't mix anymore. Scientists are actually starting to see this happening with some species of migratory birds. As it starts to warm up due to climate change, some birds are no longer migrating. And the birds that don't migrate are starting to have babies earlier before the ones that migrate come back. And so they're not able to mix and interbreed anymore. It's a timing issue here, really. All right. And then eventually they might become so different that those birds don't even recognize each other anymore. So this is temporal isolation. Their time of reproduction no longer matches. I'm going to move forward to the next slide. So if you're not done, please go ahead and pause it. So here's an example, robins. Robins usually migrate south to warmer climates for the winter time, but some birds, because it's staying warmer in the winter in some places, they're not migrating anymore. And so the birds that don't migrate are reproducing and having their babies before the migrating birds even come back. So they miss that opportunity to breed. So they eventually won't even recognize one another anymore and will evolve into two different species. Again, keep in mind, this takes thousands of years. So it's not like it's going to happen tomorrow. Third type of reproductive isolation comes about due to behavioral changes. This is behavioral isolation. In this case, their reproductive behavior changes, such as maybe their courtship behaviors start to change for some reason. And because they're not able to court, then they're not going to be able to interbreed. For example, maybe birds start to develop different songs or a different mating call for frogs. Perhaps a new scent comes about on a species. And this can come about just simply due to a mutation change. So their DNA is mutated for some way, shape, or form, and it leads to a different song, a different mating call, a different scent, and eventually that can lead to behavioral isolation. So this can also then lead to them not being able to reproduce together and make fertile offspring. If you're not done, go ahead and hit pause. I'm going to move on to the next example. So there's two types of speciation. We have allopatric and sympatric. So in allopatric, this is the evolution of a new species because they are geographically isolated. Something happens to separate them. Perhaps a new river forms. Perhaps an earthquake happens and opens up a wide chasm in between two land masses. Well, they're never going to be able to reproduce because there's this big blockage between them. So that's allopatric. The other type of speciation is called sympatric speciation. In this case, they inhabit the same geographic location, but something else is preventing them from mating. For example, maybe now they're migrating at different times, or maybe they have developed a new mating call. So the two types of reproductive isolation that we just talked about, those are examples of sympatric isolation. Sympatric speciation. Allopatric isolation would be like that geographic speciation, and sympatric would be more like the temporal speciation. So go ahead and hit pause if you're not quite done. I just want to show you one thing real quick. So I'm going to go back a few slides, maybe. Let's see. Well, it won't let me go back. But on a previous slide, you've got them all laid out with the which ones are allopatric here and which one are sympatric. All right, thank you very much. Make sure you tape these notes into your notebook.